Okay, let's start. So, um, we'll start by recapping what we were doing previously. So, we've been talking about wireless/radios. We saw last time uh, the issue of long distance versus short distance radios and how they differ. And on the long distance side, the main thing is dominated by RF power, and which is some sort of proportional to d to the power n, kind of distance dependent, uh, whereas short distance is dominated by electronics. So this is all the digital analog part which takes place, and this is distance independent. Uh, we saw that if you look at the overall radio power consumption, it kind of looks something like this. There is some sort of an optimum point, and on this side we are dominated by RF. On this side we are dominated by electronics. So for long distance radios, this T star is way to the right in case of long distance. In case of short distance, T star is way to the left. And as a consequence, for short distance, the strategy is to shut down, which is run as fast as possible, shut the radio down. Whereas for this thing, the strategy is scaling, which is take all the time that is allowable and only then kind of shut down. Okay, and the scaling could be accomplished in a variety of ways in radios, and it's the counterpart of voltage and frequency. So in this case, you scale by um, changing the way you code the information, adding extra bits for errors, things like that. So we saw that. And then also, we have also been looking at how do we share a channel previously. So a couple of lectures back, and that for the MAC protocols. And this is fundamentally about etiquette, as in how do you arbitrate. And we saw the scheme. Oh, okay, seems like it's not going to cooperate. So, with the MAC protocol, we had the strategy of waiting before you transmit, as well as backing off, so that we prevent the situation of synchronized sort of collisions. Then, last lecture, we also began to talk about what happens, how to deal with this issue that when we are in the short range situation, then we want to avoid the receiver having to just stay up. So A2.11 type systems, the way they are designed is the receiver kind of passively listens, and we were trying to optimize for the transmitter. So the whole issue of waiting and preventing collisions and all were really from the perspective of the transmitter. Essentially, the assumption being that transmit is very costly. But as we saw, transmission becomes comparable to reception or perhaps even cheaper when you start looking at shorter range radios. So for shorter range radios, then we switch to schemes where we want the receiver to sleep as much as possible. And that raises a challenge that when the transmitter does have something to send, then how does it wake up the receiver? Now, one solution is that we create a secondary radio and use that to send a wake up message. And then once that is done, then the secondary radio kind of will wake up the big radio. Except it requires additional hardware. So what we then try to do is to kind of duty cycle the radio. And I talked about the concept of duty cycling right now, but loosely speaking, duty cycling refers to shutting things down on some sort of a periodic manner. And we saw that the way we think about this is a couple of approaches. One is that we don't bother to keep any synchronization. All we make sure is that every radio wakes up on a periodic basis, except on its own period, which is somehow advertised. So in this example, A and B are waking up on periodic basis. That's indicated by those little spikes, and their period is well known. So I know every node knows at what rate its neighbors are waking up, and usually this rate would be constant. And then the idea is that when there is a packet to be sent, then instead of just transmitting the packet when the event happened, now we have to make sure that our packets with kind of rendezvous with the intended receiver. So one strategy then was, which I presented last time, is this concept of preamble sampling, where essentially when you send the packet with a long preamble. So all radio communication has preambles. Actually, all communication, Ethernet and all, they all have preambles, and they serve a variety of purposes. They're kind of acting as, hey, the packet is starting, but they are also used for the receiver to synchronize the frequency of its clock with that of the transmitter so that it can sample the bits coming in at the right time. Because even though clocks may be nominally identical, in reality, the frequencies are a little bit apart. So you basically synchronize the frequency. The preamble also is at times can also be used to pass some additional information, like is the packet from me and all. But we send a long preamble, and so preamble you can think of as some sort of a known pattern which is now essentially repeated. So instead of sending a preamble just once, the minimal length preamble which is necessary for the two parties to agree, now we kind of send the same preamble again and again. And the idea is that the target receiver B, will wake up at some point during that time, and now it will get to see the preamble, and then it will wait until the payload begins to come in. So in this strategy, the preamble is made long enough so that we are assured that the receiver will wake up during that period. And then you kind of put in some guard band and all to kind of take care of any discrepancy in time.
Is that why they can
Oh, in the sample code? No. Sample code had nothing to do with it. It was just, but even in IR communication, it's the same story. There will always be some sort of a preamble which serves these roles. Because the main challenge basically is, like I said, the clocks are different. So if I'm transmitting bits at a particular rate and you are supposed to sample them, let's say at the center of the bit, if your clock is slightly different than mine, then after a while you'll actually not be sampling the correct bit. And in fact, if you recall, when I presented UART, I had a little example of what if the sampling rates are slightly different. So this way we learn at that time what is the rate at which you are sending in terms of my clock, which is effectively saying what's the relationship between the actual frequency of your clock and the actual frequency of my clock. So preamble is always done. The only way you can get rid of it, something I mentioned last time, is if you had super stable frequency clocks. And I mentioned chip scale atomic clocks as something that Department of Defense kind of did some 10 years ago or so. But firstly, they are pretty expensive. They are export controlled kind of stuff, obviously. And the other thing is they themselves take a fair bit of power. Like in grand scheme of things, they may not be very high power. In fact, Army thinks of them as low power, but they are still around 50 to 75 milliwatt. Just to put in perspective, our entire MCUs and all are 10 to 50 milliwatts. So if you have a stable clock which is comparable or more, not really a sustainable thing for tiny systems. It's probably okay for somewhat bigger systems. Okay. So long preamble, that's one strategy. The other one, which is very closely related, is that instead of a long preamble and a single payload, I send a sequence of minimal size preamble in the payload. So essentially, I'm sending a complete packet, and I send many of them. So it's a packet train model. Okay, let's see if it's working now. Yay. Okay, so this is packet train, and it suffers from kind of a similar issue that, as far as the sender is concerned, it still has to send a fixed size packet train because it doesn't know when the receiver will wake up. But it does help the receiver because the receiver, once it receives the packet, it can go back to sleep. Okay, whereas in the previous case, the payload will always come in. And then there is a third variant of this thing where in between two packets in the train, we leave a little bit of a gap, and the receiver can acknowledge, and that way transmitter can also shut off. Okay, so depending upon how to what extreme you want to kind of save power on the two sides, you can kind of go after these different schemes. In all of them, again, these parameters like t-pole, the period, and then the time t-pole, which is how long the receiver listens, they need to be known, and some of the parameters of your preamble and gap between packets and all will be a function of them. They're kind of, if you just think about them, they're kind of mostly, there's nothing tricky about those things. Yeah.
Are there any strategies where the receiver initiates the sequence?
Yes, and I will talk about that. So, well, yeah, there are. And as is the case, there are pros and cons with all these structures. Okay. Approach 2 is we proactively keep things in synchrony. Okay. And the idea now is that we will arrange that all the nodes are going to wake up at the same time to listen. And therefore, if A has a packet to send, all it does is it locally buffers it, and then at the next transmit opportunity, it's going to send it out. Transmit opportunity being when it knows that the other party is going to be up. And now in this case, we do need to keep not the clock with the time in sync. So we basically accomplish that by having a periodic time synchronization. So periodically in these episodes, normally these episodes are just listen only. We wake up, listen, go back to sleep. Wake up, listen, go back to sleep. But once in a while, we are actually actively going to exchange messages to synchronize the clocks. And I had taken a little bit of a detour last time to describe how synchronization of time can be done. One scheme is one party shouts, time is this, everyone else listens and sets a clock. The problem with that is that one-way delay can never be compensated for. And the intuition I'd given was that, let's say my clock has a delta offset with your clock, and let's say the delay between you and me is D, then when I send you a packet saying time is 4 p.m., and then when you hear it and look at your clock, you have no way of separating out whether your clock is D plus delta away from me or 0 away from me, and the delay happens to be D plus delta or anything in between. So I cannot separate the network delay from the clock offset. But as I had described last time, and I still have that slide here, that if you do a two-way message exchange and additionally assume that the delay on two sides is the same, then you basically have two equations in terms of the timestamps and delay and the clock offset, and you can solve for them. If you do not make the assumption of DAB equal to DBA, then again the problem remains unsolvable, because every time I do a message exchange, I'm getting an additional unknown, namely the delay. So, so constancy of this assumption of symmetry of delay is kind of an important one. Now, there are ways to kind of work around this thing, because you could think about, I send a third message to do this thing. So I'm going to get a new equation, and I can perhaps more reasonably assume that the forward delay remains constant. So if you think about the way networks work, is asymmetry of delay is very common, because let's say you're on a phone, on a mobile phone and a cellular base station. Upward traffic means all the phones are competing to send things out. Downward traffic is a lot easier because the base station broadcast. Okay, so multi-access always causes more delay than broadcast, and so I think you could kind of think of clever ways around this thing to kind of have somewhat more meaningful solutions there to solve this thing, and it's kind of an area of research on its own. But somehow or the other, in our scheme out here, the radios are all synchronized, and therefore they wake up at the same time. Normally, if there's nothing going on in the network, they'll wake up, listen, go back to sleep. Once in a while, there will be that rare event. Some party will send the packet, some party in my neighborhood will send a packet, and it will have to send a preamble and a payload, and it will size the preamble with a little bit of a guard band, because despite all the synchronization, there will be some uncertainty, right, in time. And so this guard band corresponds to how accurate your time is, and you budget for it. So your preamble will not be just minimum, but will be a little bit more. And usually the way you work on this thing is you say, okay, I know what kind of clock hardware is being used. I know how much time has elapsed since the last time I synchronized, and you take all that all of that into account and budget for a guard band and put that in. So uncertainty in time is corresponding here to firstly channel being occupied for a bigger time, longer time, and it is translating into some missing power. So if you can get precise clocks, you can drive down the power. How often you time sync is going to depend upon how drifty your clocks are, which in turn depends upon obviously the clock hardware, but also depends upon temperature, acceleration, kind of a bunch of physical parameters, voltage. If voltage on your nodes jumps up and down, that affects the clock accuracy. So there's a whole bunch of stuff. If the clocks are synchronized, if the clocks are perfectly synchronized, the thing is they need to be synchronized to a sub-bit level. Okay, and the other thing is they shouldn't drift much. Okay, so there is still, I may synchronize in terms of time, but my frequency uncertainty may still be more. So there are two things going on out here. When I wake up is a matter of time synchronization. How I sample the bit is a matter of frequency synchronization, which is often called as synchronization. Okay, but your frequencies need to be very accurately aligned, and if they are not, then as the packet proceeds, you will go out of sync, and that will limit the length of the packet. So you do need preamble even if you are time synchronized, so that you can know the precise frequency estimates. So synchronized schedules, and this is, you can think of, I mean, this way of synchronized communication we encounter in multiple places. There are many communication schemes which are dependent upon kind of having a concept of mutually agreeing that nodes A and B will talk at this time. Okay, so you think of time in terms of some time slot, and then you reserve ahead that every 10 seconds after the minute, A and B will talk. Okay, so you could even imagine kind of scheduling it in that manner. So we talked about guard band, we talked about time synchronization, and that how essentially if your clocks have different frequencies, then they will not keep that ideal time, which is that the system time and kind of the global time, the universe time, they should normally be identical. In reality, there is some difference between them. So if I have nodes which are keeping different times, they will sort of drift apart. Now, if you think about the platforms we have, Hexaware has a clock, but when it powers up at 0, and then it starts counting, right? Original firmware on Hexaware had would synchronize its clock the moment it will connect to the phone. So they had some software exchange, and that would set the time on the Hexaware. But since we wiped off that firmware, so now whenever you power up the Hexaware, the time basically starts at 0. So if you have multiple Hexawares, their clocks are offset. So now you have to synchronize them. If you are going to say the two Hexawares, let's say they are on two parts of a body, and you are collecting, let's say, acceleration data, how do you know that they were collected at the same time? So there are a couple of different ways to you go around doing it. One approach is you would say, I'll leave the Hexaware as it is. I'll just collect the data, and then I will timestamp it when it arrives at the Raspberry Pi in our case, right? So I have multiple Hexaware, they're sending the data. When they arrive at the Hexaware, I will give them a timestamp. The problem with this is that, remember, our Bluetooth LE is duty cycle itself. So the delay between Hexaware and Raspberry Pi depends upon that duty cycling rate, which is potentially in milliseconds, or even more if your duty cycling rate is pretty low. So it would be worthwhile to think about timestamping on the Hexaware, particularly if you have multiple Hexaware. On a single Hexaware, things are okay because you still are sampling on a regular basis, and frequency of Hexaware clock is reasonable. These are reasonably good clocks. But if you have multiple Hexaware, like you have one, there's some projects which have multiple Hexaware, you will need to figure out a way to keep them in synchrony, perhaps using the packet exchange kind of thing that I talked about. So generally in networks, you do face this issue. Our computers also face the same issue. When they start up, they have, many of them have no way of knowing time. Even Raspberry Pi has no way of knowing time. So how do you think they synchronize? How do they get to know time? Right. So it's called Network Time Protocol, NTP. So anything. So actually, there are a few different ways. So for things which are on the internet, there is NTP. Okay. It's called Network Time Protocol. There are many organizations which maintain time servers. Those time servers either have atomic clocks or they have GPS, so that they are kind of synced with the global notion of time. And then your computer kind of contacts them, essentially using very much like that two-way handshake that I described. But there's a lot more sophisticated algorithms that go on. So Raspberry Pi, since it's running Linux, it has that stuff built in. And as long as your Raspberry Pi is on Wi-Fi, it will sync and maintain time to maybe tens of milliseconds. Okay, Raspberry Pi's local clock is pretty decent. So in terms of passage of time, it will do a decent job, but you need to set it to the global time. Okay, so that's what goes on there. Hexaware does not have that luxury. Hexaware doesn't have any direct internet connection, so it has it has to rely somehow on a intermediate device. And the normal Hexaware works with the Hexaware app on your smartphone to synchronize it. In our setting, you'll have to do it, okay, to get that timestamp going. And doing it over BLE kind of makes things a little bit trickier, as you might imagine. In particular, if you're trying to synchronize two devices, the fact that your radio itself is duty cycled comes in play, and it's going to limit things. Okay, so another issue which comes up in duty cycling radios is radio startup time. So we kind of glossed over this thing that we said, okay, the receiver wakes up every often and on. But when the radio wakes up, it's a piece of electronics which has capacitors and inductors and stuff like that. So they need to kind of power up, clock needs to power up, all those kind of things. So originally when radios used to be made, this is kind of the pre-short range era. So let's say up to 2005 or so, okay? People didn't worry about this aspect much, okay, because the focus was on Wi-Fi and cellular and stuff like that. But around that time, as Zigbee and BLE and these kind of Bluetooth and these kind of things began to emerge, this consciousness also sank in. So much like when we talk about processors, when we said that the time it takes to put to sleep or put to wake, or to wake things up, enter into picture, it's the same thing with radios, and you need to design radios which are good at rapidly waking up and becoming part of the system. So there are two aspects to it. One is the electronics waking up, okay, the capacitors charging and stuff like that, and you can certainly do a lot. One can certainly do a lot to improve that. And the second part is the radio, once woken up, becoming part of the network. That is, any message exchange with the network to say, hey, I'm up here, I'm alive. And that can also take time. Like, for example, your Wi-Fi radios, when they wake up, they have to kind of associate, they have to tell the access point, those little base stations, that they are alive, and all of that takes time too, and potentially even in seconds. So classic Bluetooth suffered from the same issue, which is every time a device became alive, it had to go through a handshake and discover things, and that would be the time also. So what's happening out here is that if you purely think in terms of the way this startup time played out, is that the startup time adds up to the on time. And now if I'm looking at devices which have to send tiny amounts of data, like every so often they'll wake up and send out sensor reading, then T on is small because I'm sending few bytes. So T startup really becomes the startup cost really becomes a higher percentage overall. You can think of it like in similar terms as a preamble, that anything which is not the payload is essentially overhead. And so you very rapidly enter into this regime where to send tiny amounts of things, like every couple of 4 bytes every second or so. To send that 4 byte, you are paying a fair bit of amount of startup and a preamble and obviously addresses and stuff like that. So that 4 byte in terms of time very rapidly becomes like 60 bytes, 100 bytes. And so efficiency plummets. So a challenge with these in this regime is that we're operating at very low throughput, very low effective rates. So anyway, so keeping the startup low and likewise keeping the preamble low are ways you can work around it. To keep the preamble small, better clocks, in the ultimate case, atomic clocks. In case of startup control, you design electronics which is agile, it can rapidly wake up, go down. That means simple radios, okay? Because if a radio is very complicated, these things will be higher. And the other thing is have simpler protocols, right? You do not require, like after wake up, lots of handshake and all. Right? Back to computers. So we talked about NTP. What other ways computer maintains time? I mean, certainly when I put my computer to sleep and then power off and turn it on, even if it's not on the internet, it knows the time. How does it? Yeah, what is it called? And since I powered off my computer, it still maintains it, right? Laptop, you can say there's a battery. What about desktop? They still maintain it. But they have a clock. So they have a clock called RTC, real-time clock. That's the industry name. So a little chip which basically has counters for year, month, day, hour, minute, second. You get that limit. And it has a point cell. So if you have a PC at home, open it up, you will see there's a little point cell with this RTC chip. Okay, and those RTC chips can talk to the motherboard usually I2C actually or SPI, one of those serial buses. On laptops, obviously, it's easy because there's a massive battery already sitting there, so they can do it. But even with laptops, also they include that RTC thing with a backup battery, so that even for long durations they can. But they're not terribly accurate. The resolution is at the second level, and they drift, but they're sufficient to get a good first order time when the system wakes up. Your phones, smartphones, even though they are on the internet, in many cases, at least I can say with confidence about Android, it doesn't use NTP. It uses a protocol called NITZ, N-I-T-Z. Okay, so NTP is for internet time sync. NITZ okay. Okay, so NITZ is used in cellular systems where your phone synchronizes with the carrier company's base station. There is also for more local area type synchronization, like in factories and all, there is an IEEE standard called 1588, which gives you much more precise timing. One thing which we just to give you a sense of type of things that we run into. So in some of the work we have been doing, we use kind of a Hexavir type device, not Hexavir, and we collect data about wrist motion, and we use that to make some inferences about what the person was doing during the course of the day. And then what we also do is so this data is collected with the device talking to an Android phone. The device itself doesn't have any independent clock, so it relies on the Android phone to send and so timestamp the data, and then the data goes out. Then separately, we collect information from other gadgets, which is kind of like the ground truth, the reality, so that we can compare whether our predictions match that reality. And that reality we collect using computers, which are on the internet, and they're using NTP. So you might say, okay, in this setup, obviously we'll expect some differences between the time synchronization, but I would have thought it would be milliseconds, tens of milliseconds, maybe 100 milliseconds. We encountered discrepancies of 30 seconds, a minute. And so we dug into it, and it turns out that actually, because smartphones and Android phones use NIPSI, this is pretty flaky and pretty unreliable. In fact, if you have Android phones which do not have, which are not on the cellular network, so you are maybe just using them with Wi-Fi, then they never synchronize because they are not using NIPSI. Okay, so if they don't have a so you pick these things and they could be significantly far apart. So we collected all this data and then we went around manually synchronizing the data, which was quite a pain. Kind of a lesson learned, and then we dug into it, and it turns out that if you want synchrony, and in the absence of cellular connectivity, your best bet is to use NTP. But since Android does not provide NTP, then you have to do it yourself at the application level. That is, your application should directly talk to the NTP server to maintain time. So this issue of timestamping is important, because if you don't have good timestamps, then whatever information you are collecting doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Okay, back to our startup story. So the startup time in this radio is like half a millisecond. That's totally wasted thing. And if you think about it, packet sizes are around a millisecond or 2 milliseconds. So a half a millisecond of startup time is pretty significant as a percentage. So making radios which can rapidly wake up is important. Okay, so I also want to talk a little bit about how power gets managed in things like Wi-Fi a little bit also. So at this stage, we've seen duty cycling, and hopefully you can relate BTLE's duty cycling to kind of what I talked about, also very similar things going on there as well. But what about power and all when it comes to kind of some of the other radios? So first thing to keep in mind is, again, the challenge that we face is that whenever you have active radios, you tend to be dominated by communication power a lot. Okay, so in a lot of these cases, your communication dominates, and then within that, receive is a very significant part, if not the dominant part. So now, if you go back to basics again in terms of MAC protocol, what can a MAC protocol do as a strategy when you are sharing things? So one is low duty cycle, so that you minimize idle listening. So we saw that in things that I was describing last time and earlier today. We also see them in Bluetooth LE and these kind of systems. But we don't see this thing in 802.11, at least the way I described previously, right? In previous thing, we were focused on what the transmitter was doing. We didn't talk about what the receiver was doing. Implicit assumption was receiver was out there listening. Collision avoidance, this I did talk about in context of 802.11, the whole etiquette mechanism that we had. We actually did not talk about collision avoidance with the duty cycle systems. Even with Bluetooth LE, we didn't talk about it, right? I mean, we have these devices which periodically wake up, transmit something. How do we make sure they don't collide? And usually the answer is you don't bother about it, because if the transmissions are rare, then collisions are also rare. Okay, so you don't worry about that. Overhearing avoidance. This is kind of a challenge too. I'm sending a packet here, but everyone else in my neighborhood is also getting that packet. And how do we, and until they receive the packet, they don't know whether the packet is for them or not. So could I avoid this overhearing thing, because overhearing is pure wasted energy. Unfortunately, very hard to avoid unless you design radios, unless you have radios which can somehow, after they have listened to a little bit of the packet up front, can say, hey, it's not for me, and go back to sleep. And reducing control overhead. This is what I meant by all this additional packets and all that you have to do. So, for example, in the scheme where we were maintaining synchronization, those synchronization packets are overhead. In Wi-Fi and all this RTS, CTS, and all those are examples of control overhead. Any additional information exchange that you are doing just to keep things running is wasted overhead, and you would ideally want to avoid that. So these are all the things that Mac protocols can do, and we saw some of them. Let's revisit 802.11 a little bit again. So previously we saw that 802.11 had this contention-based approach, which was based around collision sense, access, collision avoidance. So that's kind of a technical buzzword that they use, but you would recall this figure that we had seen previously, which is we wait for a channel to receive for a bit of time, and then go and send the data. And if we find the channel to be busy, then we wait until we find such a time, and then if we fail, then we keep backing off. So that was kind of the rough idea, and then you can also have RTS, CTS to resolve the channel, and acknowledgement to at this level. There's a bit of a philosophical conflict over whether acknowledgement at the level of the radio layer are useful or not. A lot of purists in computer science tended to believe that any acknowledgement to indicate that the packet has made it should really be end-to-end. That is, if I'm going over multiple hops, intermediate links should not bother about making things reliable, because we use TCP to get reliability anyway. The problem is wireless links tend to be pretty flaky, and so usually for performance reasons, it's a good idea to have ACKs, particularly if you're sending long packets, because longer the packet, higher the probability that it is going to suffer from an error. So we saw this thing, but in this case, we didn't talk at all about what's happening to the receiver. Now, in the normal mode, the receiver is always going to listen and therefore burn energy, but we saw that that's a bad idea. So to accomplish this, 802.11 has another mode called PCF, which stands for Point Coordination Function. And the idea here is that if the network is operating in this PCF mode, then there are time periods, so some sort of a repetition interval. And at the beginning of that time period, there is a period set aside for contention-free traffic. And the remaining period is used in that CSMA manner. So the idea is that devices which either need to send traffic in a very controlled manner, periodic manner, or have or you want to optimize your power, you want to operate the network in this manner. So again, some sort of a repetition interval, and then within the repetition interval, there is a period at the beginning, which is this PCF part, point coordination function, and then the remaining part is DCF. And all of this is PCF is optional, and if PCF is optional, then you basically have the system operating. If you don't have PCF, then the system is operating in that DCF mode, which was this slide, all the time. But if your network is running in the PCF mode, then it kind of looks like this. Now, the way it works is that under the hood, they actually have only one mechanism. If you sort of go back to this picture that I had, what it shows is that DCF is there, and then PCF is kind of built on top of it. And the way they built it on top of it is, if you recall, we have this thing called DIFS, which says how long is a channel free. So any node which is participating in this contention-based mechanism looks for the channel being free for a certain duration of time, namely at least DIFS. So the way they fake all of this is that during PCF mode, they make sure that the channel is never free for more than DIFS, or that is free always. Whenever the channel is free, it's for a duration less than DIFS. You have a question? Yeah, okay. So they kind of managed to fake their way through with this thing. And now what happens is, during the PCF region, that contention-free thing, you basically have time set aside when you can pre-assign radios to have things when they can send stuff. So you can basically any you can basically at the beginning there are many ways you could do it, but kind of one of the ideas one of the approaches is that at the beginning you can basically say I'm going to talk to A and C, and I'm going to talk to it at these times. So what everyone who is participating in this mode, they wake up at the beginning, they listen for this transmission when their turn would come, and then they wake up again at the right time. Okay. There are many ways you can structure this thing, but the main thing is that transmission is very regimented in terms of time during this period. Rest of the terminology you can kind of not worry about on this slide. So what that leads to the basic idea. So this is one approach, right? So you can do PCF, but there is an additional mechanism which is built in, and the way it works is the following: that nodes can switch themselves off for some duration, like your laptop can switch itself off. But what it will do is it will tell the access point that it is going to be sleeping. And what the access point does is that any packet which are arriving for you, it will buffer them up. And then what we do is we create a time at which the access point is going to announce what are all the packets it has. So the access point is basically buffering packets for nodes which are sleeping. And there is a fixed schedule which is implemented kind of like this using PCF. And there's a schedule according to which the base station advertises, hey, I have packets for node 1 and 5 and 10. And all the nodes, all the sleeping nodes, they can wake up during this time, see if there is a packet for them, and then wait to download. So this thing is done using the PCF mode. So essentially the idea is at the beginning of the PCF mode, the base station will advertise who all it has packets for. So essentially a bit mask it will advertise. All nodes are going to wake up at this time, and that is easily done because this whole thing is operating periodically, the frame. And so it will wake up, it will say, aha, the base station has a packet for me, and therefore it will and the base station, it will tell the base station that yes, I'm interested, and then kind of wake up at the right time. So there is this whole power management stuff in 802.11. Having said all of this, it's pretty clumsy. It's nowhere near as clean as like BLE and all, because this is still a system fundamentally designed for higher rate approaches, but that's kind of the basic idea. And to make all of this happen, as you can imagine, we need time synchronization, because again, we are telling the nodes they have to wake up at this fixed time. So somehow the nodes need to know the time, and that all of that is done using in 802.11 using kind of a time synchronization thing. And the basic idea here is base station says this is the time, okay, and then everyone tweaks the clock according to that. So that's how time works, and it's reasonably accurate for the purposes out here. Okay, it's not a terribly accurate time synchronization, but all you're looking out here is to be within millisecond type ranges, and that works out perfectly fine. So 802.11 then ends up looking something like this, the overall kind of a picture, which is the access point, the base station, generates timestamp beacons and transmits them every beacon interval, which is around 100 milliseconds or so. Nodes wake up and look at the timestamp carried in that beacon and adjust their clocks. These beacons also carry a traffic indication map. Traffic indication map is basically base station telling everyone who all it has packets for. So it will basically, it's like a little table. So all packets received for nodes which were sleeping and have been buffered there are announced. And nodes which woke up in that cycle and find that the traffic indication map is saying they have a packet for them, one or more packet for them, they are going to request it from the access point and ask for it. And there is also a special mode that packets that are broadcast packets, because occasionally we have packets which we want to send to everyone. So the way they are handled is that the traffic indication map will also say, hey, there is a broadcast packet, and all the nodes, and they're sent out immediately. So all the nodes kind of just stay up, listen to the broadcast packet. So there's a bunch of kind of obvious mechanisms which are layered on top of 802.11 to make all of this work out. But even with all of this, 802.11 is not in the Bluetooth league of power efficiency. It's just not designed for it. For the hardware itself is your Wi-Fi radios are order of half a watt to a watt. So they are just designed for a very different regime of power consumption than Bluetooth devices tend to be. Okay. So this comes to a question that Trevor had asked a little bit ago, which is, can the receiver ask for the packets as opposed to the sender? So it turns out that people have explored this idea. It's called receiver-initiated protocols. None of the standards use them, but people have explored them in research. So basic thing is the following. Protocols that we have discussed thus far, they were sender initiated. That is, sender had an event or a piece of data and it decides when to send it out. And the receiver is supposed to sort of either stay up or at least tell that it's going to be available, and then we send it out. So, sorry. Yeah, okay. So essentially, the communication is triggered by the sender initiating the transaction, and then the receiver listens to it. So it's the sender's choice. But there is, I printed out these PDFs with these animations, so they're horrible at this point, but okay. And the preamble sampling that we talked about is still sender initiated. So we send a preamble which is long enough, and that designs so the receiver receives. That's saw that previously as well. Additional issues that come up with this kind of a sender initiated thing are following, that if the receiver wakes up out here and kind of a little bit later, and it sees, and there is some noise in the channel, like maybe your microwave oven is running, then the receiver would say, aha, there is something, and then it will attempt to try to receive it. And it will stay up until such time it realizes that there is actually just junk there. So the problem with the sender initiated that happens is that receiver has no reliable way of knowing that, distinguishing between noise on the channel and a valid packet on the channel. So that's one challenge. So again, the reason is the following: that remember, the receiver wakes up at an arbitrary point in time, and if there is noise on the channel or a valid packet on the channel, you cannot tell immediately. You have to listen for a while before you can say, yeah, it's not a packet, or it's just noise. So in noisy environments, the scheme that we previously talked about can result in a lot of false wake-ups or false activation of the receive circuit. And since we said receive is power hungry, we want to avoid that. We want to prevent the receiver from connecting. A similar challenge occurs if there is other traffic also, right? I mean, if there are other nodes operating in that area, perhaps other networks, will cause the same issue. Your system will keep picking up falsely and waste energy in the reception. So to avoid all of this, the idea now is that let the receiver decide when it wants to receive. So in a sense, this is taking to its logical conclusion. If transmitter was expensive, then let the transmitter decide when it wants to send, so that the transmit effort is not wasted. If the receiver is expensive, then let the receiver decide when to receive, so that the receive effort is not wasted. And that is what led to the so-called receiver-initiated MAC protocols. And kind of the idea out here is the following. And let me jump ahead to the final slide out here. So the basic idea out here is the following, that the sender is the one now which is listening. And the receiver sends a probe saying, is there something for me? The sender receives the probe, then sends the data. Okay, so we kind of turn the tables in this case. And again, the idea is that because the receiver is energy constrained. So the moral of the story out here is that the energy constraint okay, I don't know what's happening to the laptop, but energy constrained nodes should be the one who should be the one initiating. So in the short range regime, you can make a reasonable argument that the receiver should be the one deciding when to transmit, so that should ask the transmitter to do it, and so that we avoid this. Now, BLE doesn't operate like that. So BLE is sender initiated, and in fact, as I mentioned a short while ago, all the standards that you will find there all sender initiated. So receiver initiated is being more of a academic curiosity, but it does have advantage, which is it really takes the argument to its logical extreme, saying if receiver is energy constrained, let's minimize wasted receiver. And again, what's happening is that the receiver makes the probe, sender stays up, and then sends the data. So you could imagine BLE like protocol, a BLE like system being structured in this particular manner. But again, they are not. So this is theoretical exercise. Really, fundamentally, what MAC protocol is doing is, MAC protocol is like the operating system scheduler for radios. That's what it is. Just like the scheduler decides when the processor should, what should the processor do, when should it do it, and when to put the processor to sleep, MAC protocol does exactly the same thing. When should the packet be sent? Should it be transmit or receive? Should it, how to set up those knobs? So MAC is the OS for the radio. That's kind of a one, or at least the OS scheduler for the radio. And so the most crucial decision that a MAC protocol really makes from a power perspective is when to put something to sleep or awake. And if the MAC protocol is dealing with radio transmitters and radio receivers, it stands to reason that if you are receive constrained, then it should minimize wastage of received power. So there is nothing else magical which is happening. The additional twist which MAC protocols face, which processors don't, is that they are distributed, and if one party is supposed to wake up the other party, and if they are asleep, then I don't have any easy way of doing it. So we have to kind of fake, resort to some fake to make that happen. Okay, so that was MAC protocols, and we saw sender initiated, which is pretty much of 802.11, Bluetooth, they're all sender initiated, and then this receive initiated concept, which is based upon channel probing, and not really part of any standard, but is a useful concept. Let's see. Let's take a 5-minute break. And I'll try to figure out what's happening to my laptop. What do you mean by is broken?
didn't show anything.
Did you look at the Piazza emails?
Yeah. I tried. Yeah, and so I ordered another one, but
Why don't you try to load the original firmware and see if it works?
yeah, I
Oh, you did?
yeah.
You tried to load the original
Yeah.
firmware. Oh, okay.
And so I ordered another one that it will arrive next Wednesday. So
Okay,
I
so you can borrow one from me.
from
Yeah, from Amr you can borrow, or I can give you one. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, sure. We'll have one more. Unfortunately, Amr is having some medical issues and all, so we are kind of without a little bit on that front. So we'll have one more assignment. I hope to send it out tomorrow or Saturday, and it will be on good. Okay. Yeah. And that's why the grading is also delayed because of last time.
You get some like header pin for the Raspberry Pi.
Header pins?
Yep.
Just go to my lab and ask for someone, or actually, yeah, I don't. I'll see if I have anything in my home, but you're welcome to swing by my lab, and we usually have these headers in the work area. Okay. If you don't find Amr, you can look for G, and we can help you. Okay, or any student. Just say you're in my class.
Just go to the lab.
Just go to lab, yeah. And just say you're my student in the class, and okay.
And choose few solid.
You can solder them too as well.
Would they work without
No. They're not. They won't work without soldering. You have to solder them, but there's a soldering iron in my lab. If you decide to solder there, please shut off the soldering iron when you're done. I have lots of instances of students leaving them on, so that's fine. But you're welcome to.
But these pins are rather small, so you can practice on something else.
You have never soldered?
I have, but I haven't
It's not hard. It's not hard. Yeah, you can practice on something, but yeah. If Amr was around, he could have shown you, but we have a setup there with a magnifying glass, and also you can make use of that to simplify things a little bit. Yeah. Okay, so let's restart. So the final thing I wanted to cover in this space was again kind of and the role that time ends up playing. And in this case, I'm focusing on a very specific communication pattern that occurs quite a bit, and that is oftentimes there's a bunch of nodes out there, and you want to send some information to all of them. Okay, so this is the broadcast thing. So so we want to flood the network. You can imagine many uses of it, right? I mean, I might want to say, all nodes which are controlling light switches, shut off the light, stuff like that, right? Or I could be maybe disseminating some sort of a command. Maybe it's time synchronization. I want to send out information about, hey, the time is this. And a challenge out here is the following, that I can certainly do it to my immediate neighbors easily, but what if the network has all these multiple hops and all, which again ends up happening with many of the standards, including kind of Bluetooth 5 now. So the challenge which comes with this flooding problem is the following. I send out a packet, all my neighbors hear it. So let's say everyone in the first row heard it. And their job is to send it to the next row. But the challenge is that they have no way of coordinating. In fact, they may not even know each other's existence. Right? So if they both transmit, then there are two problems. Firstly, the packet collides, and it's unnecessary transmission, even if the packet was not collided. They want to separate them out because there is no point in two people sending the same piece of information. So could we make flooding more efficient? So flooding can, in the worst case, be exponential, because what will happen is send the packet out, first two students in the first row, they both hear it, they both decide to transmit. First time around, the packets will collide. Then they will back off. One of them will back off, and the other. So as you can see, the time delay builds up because they are uncoordinated. And the same thing will happen even more at the next level, because each one's transmission are going to be heard by multiple parties, and the same game will play over. So if not done carefully, flooding can actually be extremely inefficient, even though in theory you can imagine an optimal way of doing the flooding if only you were to be able to coordinate things out. But we don't have any central entity, perhaps we don't even know the topology of what exists, so we want to make flooding very efficient. And you see this thing playing out very easily. I mean, like for example, a lot of the home automation products nowadays use this thing called Z-Wave, which is a short-range radio protocol. So a lot of these smart lighting stuff and all are based around that, switches and all. And it uses flooding. And you can see how painfully slow it is. If you add a node to the network, it takes minutes, tens of minutes for the network to discover the new topology. So the way it works is it discovers a new topology and then kind of sticks with that. So long term it is efficient. The transient behavior is annoyingly slow because the discovery and all it does using its routing strategy is flooding, basically. Okay, and that's painfully kind of slow. So you want to be able to do flooding and all in a quicker, cleaner manner. So there has been some work along those lines, and they all kind of boil down to tightly integrating time synchronization with flooding. Okay, and essentially the two things, you're creating a synchronized network, and flooding kind of become part of the same protocol. So I picked one work from a few years ago because it conveys the concepts rather well, but there are several others that kind of dance around the same thing. Okay, so the setting we have out here is there is one initiator. This could be kind of like your home gateway or something like that. And then I have a whole bunch of nodes. These are the receivers. These are the little light bulbs and light switches and sensors and stuff like that. And the idea is that initiator has packet, and we want to send it out to all the nodes as rapidly as possible, as efficiently as possible. So problem in blind flooding, which is I hear the packet and I'm going to retransmit, is that explosion in collisions that I was describing earlier on. So usually one of the ways around dealing with this explosion in collision is that you identify nodes that will relay the packet. So we somehow kind of pre-assign that there are certain nodes, only they will retransmit, only they will act as relays, and we kind of make sure that they provide adequate coverage to the whole network. So like I might say, row 1, only Adam is going to transmit, and so on and so forth. I kind of just define this thing for the whole network. The problem with this approach is that I have to maintain state. If the network changes, if something is moved around, I have to refigure that topology. So not very desirable from my perspective. So what this algorithm did was it provided a way so that I'll just take one pass through the network very efficiently, and everyone will get to know the piece of information. and I don't need to maintain any state. No one needs to know I'm the router or not. Okay, so that's what Glossy achieved, and let's see how it went around doing it, because it's a pretty it works pretty nicely. So the way it does is the following, that it divides time into two types. So periodically, the net or sporadically, it doesn't have to be periodic. Sporadically, the network goes into a flooding mode. So we can imagine that 1 second out of every 10 seconds, we'll say will flood. Okay, so we set aside some time. So let's call that the glossy mode. Okay, and then during this glossy mode, we perform a fast flooding. Okay, so what does it mean? So it relies on a very key insight. If I get two packets or packets from two nodes at the same time, normally we say we are colliding, right? That if I'm hearing two parties are sending packet to me, normally I won't say I'm colliding. But what if those packets were identical and perfectly overlapping in time? Okay, so two parties are saying exactly the same waveform at the same time. Then what I'm going to receive is summation of them, and I would still be able to recover it, right? So packets colliding is a problem if either they are different or they are misaligned. But if they are perfectly aligned in time and identical content, then there is no collision. So what this thing seeks to do is, now in flooding, it's the same information, right? We are trying to send the same packet to everyone. So first problem is taken care of. So we really have to worry about the second problem. Can we align them precisely? And by precisely, we mean to a fraction of the length of a bit, right? So then the thing would be, I'll send a packet, there are two students in the first row, they will transmit, and since identical packet and they transmit with at the same time, no collision to the other end. Now we are also relying out here on that the distances are short, because obviously if two parties are transmitting identical things at the same time, but one is very close to me and the other is far to me, by the time packet reaches me, it should be misaligned. But short range things, the speed of light is what, 3 × 10⁸ meter per second. So that means that in a nanosecond, we travel roughly a foot, okay, 1/3 of a meter. So short range radios, you're looking at time discrepancies of, let's say we are operating on a 100-meter thing, right? So 100-meter would translate into a distance discrepancy of 300 feet. Sorry, 100 meter is 300. So it will roughly be 100 nanoseconds. Okay. So that limits the speed of the radio. If my radio is many megabits per second, again I can't do this thing, because that delay differential will translate into a difference of more than a bit. But if I have relatively slow rate radios like our Bluetooth and all, and if I have relatively local nearby networks, and since we are not looking at long range, then I can have this property that if T1 and T2 are sending packets at the same time, then R can still receive it. So that's what this thing does. Multiple nodes transmit the same packet at the same time during flooding, so that, and as long as the delta between them, the temporal separation between them, is kept small enough, half a microsecond in this original paper, we are good to go. You can take this concept further, and there's some subsequent work where even with non-identical packets, you can make things to work, because maybe I know something about one packet and the other, but I'll leave that aside for a moment. In this work, basically, R receives a packet with high probability if T1 and T2 were sending identical packets and they were very tightly aligned in time. And tight alignment here was half a microsecond. So now what happens is that if we are able to pull this off, if we are able to transmit packets synchronized in time, then what can happen is initiate sends a packet out here. So initiator sends the packet, it's heard by all its one hop neighbors. Okay, there's no problem in doing this, so that's straightforward. But now what will happen is those one hop neighbors are going to send the packet out, relay it, but they are now going to do it in a very tight time synchronized manner. They are going to transmit, the packet is identical, they're going to transmit it at the same time. Okay, so this places some pretty tight timing requirements on both the software and the radio, okay, so that the outgoing packets at these different nodes have to be aligned to within half a microsecond without them talking to each other. There's no wire running or anything like that. So every little delay matters in this case. So if we can pull this off, that's how things proceed. So in one pass, I can basically have the whole information going through and no collisions. Okay, is this clear to everyone what's going on, right? I mean, perfectly synchronized transmissions, and in one clean pass, I can kind of do it. So this is another look at the same thing. So there is the initiator, and there are a bunch of receivers in the first hop. So the initiator sends the packet, and the receiver at the first hop receives it. So that's this guy out here that receives it. Then what will happen is this receiver is going to send the packet again, and this packet will be heard by the second hop node, and obviously it's also going to be heard by the initiator because the initiator is a neighbor. And meanwhile, all the receivers at one hop are going to do this transmission in a synchronized manner. So we are going to make sure that our implementation in the software and hardware is very tight turnaround time, tight and predictable. Okay, both are important. So actually, in the original paper, these guys were using an MCU and they were counting like instructions and all to make it a very tight system. Okay, so they transmit synchronously, and now what happens is same process repeats at the next time, and so on and so forth. And additional stuff is that they kind of keep count of how many packets are going.
How do you, does this account for all the nodes not being the same distance apart?
So that's the comment I was making earlier, that if these distances are small enough, then the discrepancy is not that much, right? I mean, if you think about it, if I'm sending a packet to you and someone at the back of the room, this room is, I don't know, 50 feet, that's not much of a delay relative to that half a microsecond. So this does require that either your radio be slow or your network be small, okay, some ratio of that. So it will not work for big networks and fast radios. Okay. So that's the sort of okay, so that's the fast propagation idea, and yeah, so that's what's going on. So what's going on out here is that every time this message is going through, you're actually also getting an opportunity to synchronize. So there is an implicit synchronization which is also happening, and moreover, you have to have a very predictable implementation of the whole code, because when you receive a packet and you're going to relay it, that has to be done in a very predictable manner. Predictable to half a microsecond in their work. Okay, so I think what they talked about in their work was that execution has to start at the same time. So normally what happens, a packet arrives, an interrupt is generated, you have an interrupt handler, you react to it. If you had something blocking you, maybe your interrupt handler will not fire at the same time. If you have a process scheduler which can pump you off, all those kind of things come into play. So normally when you respond to these things, there is sufficient software jitter that comes into play. All of that has to be mitigated away. So to make the scheme happen, it has to be done at a low level and not sitting on top of a OS scheduler where the uncertainties in timing can be quite high. You have to also compensate for hardware variations. So the challenge out here is that the clock on these different nodes will be slightly different. They may think they are doing half a microsecond according to their local clock, but in reality, maybe one guy is a little bit far apart than the other. And so any such discrepancy is going to lead to collisions and therefore uh, effectively a packet error rate. Other variations in hardware come from the fact that different chips, processor chips, always are slightly different. Okay, so all these kind of things are just natural part of hardware. And then finally, deterministic execution time. So if your processor has cache in it, that can affect things. Okay, because maybe the two nodes are receiving packets at the same time, but the state of the software was different. In one case, the cache state was one, in the case the cache state was different. And those little things can add up to the thing. So making this work out, I mean, obviously if you have a dedicated microcontroller doing this, it's much easier than if you're running it on top of something which is not. So what these guys do is they compensated for some of these variations that can occur. So they first profiled it, and then they execute a variable number of no-ops to kind of balance things out so that the outgoing action is identical. Essentially, the problem they have is the following, that a bunch of nodes have to act in synchrony. Okay, that's really what they're trying to solve. But they were able to do it. Thing, and with that, they have this single pass flooding, which is super efficient. Yeah.
So you keep mentioning single pass flooding, but if you open the slide that you showed, that one,
Mhm.
right? Only until I was trying to see this
No, okay, so here now an additional packet is being sent. Okay, so when I say single pass for one packet, it's a single pass. I never have to do that. So what's happening out here is initiator sends one packet, and then there's a pipeline in the center. Initiator can send the next packet and this one. Okay, so still single pass. If you look at packet number one, it's never retransmitted. Okay, so while so I sent one packet, and I cannot send the one packet immediately in the next time slot, because in the next time slot these two guys will be transmitting their packet, and it will be colliding with me. But in the time slot after that, I can. So every alternate time slot, I can send a new packet.
So it becomes like on average it's
It is one port.
and
It is.
it still takes time for it to propagate through the rest.
Sure, it takes time, but I send it to row 1, row 1 sends to row 2, row 2 sends to row 3. There is never any collision in this process, and there will never, under quasi-ideal conditions, this should not result in any need to retransmit ever. Now, of course, in reality, because there are other sources of noise and all, which will cause issues, but insofar as your insular network is concerned, it's like one wave goes in and the other wave follows, and the other wave follows 2 slots behind. So what this is showing is that this was their particular implementation. They were using a pretty puny microcontroller. I mean, this work is from 2011, so you can see sort of that era. So what they are showing is that they were able to achieve half a microsecond by all those software tricks and all. And at hop number 8, they were still at a 0.4 microsecond thing. Because part of the challenge here is your time sync error builds up the farther away you are from the initiator, right? Because each party is taking a slightly different action, and that error will keep building up. But they have a pretty good performance. I mean, up to 8 hops you can travel a lot. They are able to keep things bounded within 0.5 microsecond. So essentially the point they're making is that they can efficiently flood to networks of diameter, of radius 8 hops, which is pretty cool. I mean, you can easily cover let's say buildings and homes and all with that kind of stuff. Okay, so I think with that I am done with the wireless story. Obviously, some of the things I have talked about are not applicable to Bluetooth. We are only using Bluetooth. Some of them are applicable to Wi-Fi, but since we don't have control over access points, so you can't play with them. But these things exist in a variety of products because there are so many different sort of standards which are floating around. So if you have better time sync, you can do a lot, or if you have better time, then you can do a lot in terms of saving energy. And so the key takeaways that I wanted to go with is the following. Number one, receive power. Okay, that's what matters a lot. So you have to optimize for it. The second thing is time plays a very critical role. Hopefully that point has sort of come out adequately in this story. Third thing is that we are in a regime where we tend to send small amounts of information, and therefore overheads begin to kill you also. Now, you may, I mean, obviously there are things where we don't, we are not in the regime of small data, but that's relatively rare. So let me explain. A lot of you guys are doing projects where you plan to collect some sensor data. From some sensor data, you want to make some inference. Okay, so you want to do some machine learning, something on top to make an inference like gesture or stuff like that. Now, if you think about it, there are two modes that we operate these things. One is the standard mode. The data is collected, inference is made, and we take some action based upon that. In that case, data rates are pretty low, particularly if you do computation on the device, which, as we saw, computation is cheaper than doing communication, so that should help. There's a second mode which has emerged quite a bit lately, which is we want to collect the raw data so that we can train the model. We can learn, right? We are learning from these devices. And there, you do need to extract lots of data. Fortunately, though, that's not the common mode of operation. Like, for example, let's say Apple is developing a new product, they're going to conduct some pilot study and whatnot and operate devices in that special mode of collecting lots of data. It's not generally the norm that you are going to be collecting high frequency data all the time from normal users. So that mode is encountered less, but it is changing because we are moving towards sensors like imagers and all, which do generate a lot of data. But generally speaking, in a lot of products, we are in the regime of small amounts of data. So overheads begin to matter quite a bit. The other thing that we learned in this first thing is multi-hop helps you, right? Because because of that d to the power n, if it were to be the case that energy for transmission, power for transmission was proportional to distance, then multi-hop would have been useless. In fact, it would have been worse than useless. But because it is at least d square and usually more, power of 4 or 5, multi-hop helps you tremendously. Okay, so that's something to bear in mind. So those are, and the other thing that we learned, that radios, it's very hard to, for most commonly used radios, it's very hard to simultaneously hear and transmit. So full duplex is hard. Moreover, it's very hard to distinguish between what you are transmitting and what you are receiving, or it's very hard to see that you are having a collision because your own signal is heard very loudly than the signal coming in. The discrepancy is many orders of magnitude. But, and I have made allusions to that we do know what you are sending out, so you can subtract it out if you are very clever about it. And some of the newer academic work has begun to do that. So, as you might suspect, there's a lot going on the wireless side because battery-powered wireless devices are just still playing a very important role, and so a lot of things are happening. I also mentioned that there are these passive radios, which is kind of another cool technology which is emerging, where instead of the radio generating the carrier wave, it actually uses someone else's carrier wave and then just puts information on top of it. And that we do by, the analogy I had given was sunlight and using a mirror, and it's the same analogy that it's RF signal from someone else, the sun, and I have an antenna whose reflectivity I change by changing the impedance at the antenna with some simple electronics, and that way I can ride information on top of a radio wave which may be coming from a local TV station or a nearby access point. In fact, just a day or two ago, because the researchers who are doing it on Facebook friends with them, and so the UW, University of Washington group, they have now they have managed to create things, batteryless electronics, which they have on top of an insect, and which collects information and transmits it out. Because once you go batteryless, weight reduces, size reduces, obviously, okay, and the other cool thing is it's a lot more eco-friendly because all these tiny lithium batteries embedded everywhere is a problem in itself. So whatever you can do batteryless is actually pretty amazing, and so some of these groups which are doing stuff is pretty cool. None of the commercial things are using it yet, but obviously, as you might imagine, there are startups and all among these worlds which are doing that. So that's the ultimate case of low power wireless, zero power wireless, but with the caveat that now suddenly you're back again into that regime where computing is more expensive because sending bits is free. Okay, so that changes things also. Okay, so I'm going to stop out here. I don't know what's happening with so if he is not able to do the discussion section tomorrow, I'm going to check with him. He's kind of not responding to me either, so I don't know what's going on. But I'll come by in the class, and if he's not there, then I'm going to what I'll probably spend time on is describing how to process sensor data with the machine learning stuff. So that would be useful to some of you guys for your project. Okay, so it might turn into a lecture. So let's see.